The History of Poland Podcast, Episode 58, Stefan Batory. Hello and welcome back. We left off last time with the end of the reign of Henry III, King of Poland and later King of France. Henry had decided that, after trying it out for a bit, the throne of Poland was not nearly as interesting as the throne of France. There were many factors for this decision. There was the ability for Henry to reign as a near-absolute monarch in France, the ability for him to wage a brutal war of religious persecution, and the ability for him to be central to the affairs of Europe. But beyond these, one thing that Henry was not a fan of was the Polish nobility's insistence on their, quote, rights. So, upon hearing that his brother, the King of France, had passed away, Henry left Poland in the dead of night and headed back to France. He ruled there as King of France until his death. But what of the Polish throne? That's what we'll turn our attention to today. It was a tricky set of circumstances. I mean, if a king dies, that's fine, right? You just go down the line of succession. And if a king is captured, that doesn't make them not king. It just means that they're not directly overseeing the affairs of state. And of course, a king could be deposed. But what to do with a king that just says, I'd rather be king of that land, thank you very much, it's been real, see you later. In Adam Zamoyski's The Polish Way, we hear how the Poles reacted to this strange situation they found themselves in. Quote, the Poles felt deeply wounded by the behavior of the king, and when the shock died away, a new question arose. Was there or was there not an interregnum? It was a nice question, to which precedent afforded no answer. In the autumn, letters were dispatched to the newly crowned Henry III of France, one from the Polish senators and deputies, one from the Lithuanians. The Poles gave an ultimatum. If he did not present himself in Krakow by May 12, 1575, the throne would be declared vacant. The Lithuanians merely pleaded for his return. Henry replied that he had every intention of keeping the Polish throne and suggested sending his younger brother, the Duc d'Alençon, as viceroy. The Poles would have none of it and called a new election. End quote. I personally love the gall of Henry. I mean, he left against the nobility's wishes, went to become King of France after nearly no time in Poland, and when told he needs to come back, he says, I think I'm going to stay king, but don't worry, I will send my brother to rule in my stead. I mean, the absolute self-indulgent privilege of this guy. It's also no surprise that the Poles rejected the entire Valois family. The throne was formally declared vacant in May of 1575, and as the axiom goes, power loves a vacuum. If you're imagining that people are going to neatly organize themselves into factions, have a short influence campaign to get their candidate to the front of the pack, and then vote in an orderly fashion, you are in for a rude awakening. I'll quote from Norman Davies' God's Playground, in which he describes the Barnum-like election season. Quote, the electoral Sejm, which finally met at Warsaw in November 1575, resembled a battleground. There were more Cossacks than voters, and every voter carried an arquebus, an early gun, a mace or lance. There were at least half a dozen serious candidates and twice as many sponsors prepared to spend words and ducats. There was Alfonso il Deste, Duke of Ferrara, sponsored in spite of himself by no less than Dr. Solomon Ashkenazi, a Jewish physician from Constantinople. He was announced by the poet Guarini, who described his master's incredible love for the Polish nation. There was Ivan the Terrible, whose troops happened to be ravaging the eastern provinces at the time. At the previous election, he had suggested that he would willingly rule over Lithuania and Poland as well, if so invited, and would multiply their liberties, but that he would like Livonia and the Ukraine to be given to Moscow. Then there was Archduke Ernest again, and John of Sweden, and another Habsburg, the Archduke Ferdinand. Finally, there was Stefan Batory, the Prince of Transylvania. After extraordinary contortions, in which the nuncio offered to give Ivan the title of Emperor of Constantinople if he withdrew in favor of Ernst, Jakub Ubczanski proposed that Ivan, Jan Vasa, and the Emperor should rule simultaneously. A clear contest emerged between the Habsburgs and the Transylvanian. End quote. To recap, the scenarios tossed around included electing an Italian duke supported by the papal nuncio, electing Ivan the Terrible, who was currently at war in Poland, and giving him the bonus title of Emperor of Constantinople, something that none of these people had a right to give away, electing the current King of Sweden, electing one of two Habsburgs, or potentially electing multiple people at the same time and having them rule jointly. There are an endless number of fun alternate histories out there just based off of this one event alone. But we don't have time for such speculation because history was being made. There were so many political machinations at work that it's a bit hard to keep track of them. But underlying each of them was that no one wanted anyone else to win. Many Polish nobles didn't want the Austrians to win. The Austrians didn't want the Ottomans to gain influence, and vice versa. No one wanted Ivan the Terrible to win, except for Ivan, and Ivan wanted the land, whether by election or conquest. In the end, there was only one candidate that seemed to fit just enough of the bill to make it through: Stefan Batory. Bettori was born on September 27, 1533, to the Palatin of Transylvania. He grew up as many minor nobles did, with a solid education and exposure to the broader European sphere. He had traveled Europe, studied in Italy, and seen the way that other societies function. In short, while he was Transylvanian through and through, he was not unaware that there were different ways of getting things done. As an adult, he had a notable career in warfare. He had led troops into battle, been held prisoner by rival armies, and acquitted himself well through it all. And after all this, he was elected in 1571 as the Prince of Transylvania. As Davies puts it, quote, "He was a fervent Catholic who made his career in resistance to the most Catholic emperor. He ruled over a state where all four religions enjoyed autonomy. He was familiar both with forceful action and with government by consent." End quote. His resume impeccable and the need for a king becoming ever more urgent, Bettori jumped to the head of the pack. And there was no time to waste, as there were revolts domestically, invasions externally, and division in the leadership. The nobility was ready to elect Stephen, but only on the condition that he take Anna, daughter of the deceased King Sigismund I, as his wife. Stephen readily agreed to this condition. Then, interestingly, the pieces began to fall into place. As Davies tells us, quote, "He was helped by the Ottoman Sultan, who ordered his army to march against the Habsburg Empire as a means of frustrating Habsburg candidacy. Bettori hastened over the Carpathians and entered Krakow on March 23, 1576, the very day on which the emperor was finally undertaking to do the same. He rode a Turkish charger and wore a heron plume in his tall fur cowpack. He was attended by 500 Transylvanian knights, with leopard skins slung over their golden breastplates, and by 1,000 veteran hedjaks. He was welcomed by 8,000 Polish noblemen. On May 1st, he married Anna, and contrary to all the rules, was anointed king by Bishop Karnkowski. At that, all resistance ceased." End quote. And so Poland once again had a king, and this time it was one that wasn't just going to run home when things got a little tough. And tough they would get. Immediately on being elected king, Bettori faced incredible obstacles, yet he did admirably rise to the occasion, for the most part. There were a few immediate fires to put out, and we'll go through the causes of each of them, and then how Bettori dealt with the issues. In order, they are the domestic rebellions, the tension between nobility and monarchy, finances, martial capability, and martial efficacy. Let's take these one by one as they build on each other and build Bettori's reign into something of note. First, domestic rebellions. In northern Poland, on the Baltic Sea, there is situated a city named Gdansk in Polish and Danzig in German. We are familiar with it if you've been paying attention. Gdansk was one of the primary ports of entry into Poland, and as a result, most foreign sea-based trade flowed through it. This was extremely lucrative for the city, as they were able to take advantage of travelers looking for goods to buy. They were able to levy taxes and fees on merchants. They were often the first to hear news from far-flung areas, and they had easier access to the world at large. All of these advantages made Gdansk one of the jewels of the Polish realm and very influential in Polish politics. During the election contest, the leaders of Gdansk had voiced their support behind a Habsburg. Then, when Bettori was elected instead, they started to cause some problems, with strong hints that they wouldn't recognize his kingly authority. Bettori responded to this nascent uprising with a commercial blockade in September of 1576. When this didn't bring the rebels to heel, he sent an army to attack. The army attacked in April of 1577, and while they weren't able to fully take the city, specifically the Lantern Fortress, this did produce enough pressure to get an agreement signed. So Bettori now has a stable port city, removes an obstacle to his authority, and has shown other would-be rebels that he will back up his policies with force if needed. Second on his to-do list was tension between the nobility and the monarchy. There was a spectrum to how Bettori dealt with the nobility, sometimes with gracious forgiveness, sometimes with an imposing strong will. For the former, we hear from a chronicler that, quote, "At the Sam of Thorn in 1576, when some of the members kept pestering him to explain his intentions, he flew into a rage, saying, 'I was not born in a pigsty, I was born a free man. I love my freedom and intend to guard it. By God's will, it was you who elected me king. It was at your request that I came here. It was you who placed the crown on my brow. So I am your king. But I will not be a fashioned or painted one. I wish to rule and will not let anyone pick my nose.'" End quote. While those may not be the exact words he used at the time, at the very least they illustrate he was adamant about being his own man, even if it meant taking actions that the nobility was opposed to. Yet Bettori knew he couldn't just strong-arm people into submission. They elected him, and while that didn't mean he had to run every decision by them, it did mean they needed to respect him. So, as Davies tells us, he used his irritation with the setup of the judicial system and his desire to reform it to his advantage. Davies says, quote, "Seeing that the business of the higher courts of royal justice had been suspended for half a decade, he abandoned the monarch's prerogative to hear appeals in civil and criminal cases. Instead, he directed Zamoyski, now raised to the crown chancellorship, to devise a system whereby judicial affairs could be directly controlled by the nobility. The institution of the Crown Tribunal in 1578 and of a similar Lithuanian tribunal in 1581 removed any possible fears of impending royal tyranny and ensured the cooperation of the Sejm and the nobility for the king's more pressing interests." End quote. I love this move. He saw that the courts weren't working, likely because anyone could appeal to the king, and at the same time, he didn't really seem to want that authority. So he gave that authority over to the nobility in the form of a crown tribunal, over which he would likely still retain influence. This not only solved his problem with the judiciary, but also gave him much more leeway with the nobility when pursuing his other goals. It's really a win-win situation. Next, we'll move on to the financial problems of state. When he became king, the treasury was nearly empty. Within a decade, it had been transformed. Davies goes into quite a bit of ordeal about the exact sources of revenue and how much they brought in, which I won't bore you with, but the end result is impressive, a near doubling of annual revenue through taxes, fees, mining operations, and other sources to the crown. Now, this didn't make him wealthy beyond all rival, but combined with one-off payments that he was given in exchange for political favors, it gave Bettori a great deal of financial maneuvering room. It also meant that he would have money to make real changes. Near the top of this list was the military. Whether you're looking at the campaigns of Alexander the Great or a modern nation-state's military, there is one common denominator. They need money. And when there's plenty of money available, you can make big improvements. That's exactly what Bettori did, in two parts. By reforming the royal army itself, and then by repairing the relationship with the formidable Cossacks. Let's start with the reform of the royal army. I distinguish this as the royal army, as it was the state forces that were under the direct command of the king. There were other armies available in Poland, but they were a bit more indirect, as they could only be raised with the assent of the nobility that governed their daily lives as non-professional soldiers. These soldiers, on the other hand, of the royal army, were more akin to a standing army, though nothing like how we see professional standing armies in modern times. We hear in God's Playground how this army was improved by Bettori from Davies, who says, quote, "In 1578, the Sejm was persuaded to approve the formation of the selected infantry. They were drawn from the peasants of the crown estates in the ratio of 1 man for every 20 holdings. Each soldier was to be clothed and supported by the 19 neighboring families who did not serve. They were armed with muskets. At the same time, the old mounted spearmen were gradually replaced by the mounted husaria, one of the legendary formations on European battlefields over the next century." Davies continues on, telling us of the reforms that also reached the Cossacks, saying, quote, "After the army, it was the turn of the Dnieper Cossacks. Settled on the outer fringes of organized government, they had defied all previous attempts to control them. They lived in Tartar style from loot and pillage. In years when they refrained from devastating Poland or Lithuania, they were devastating the Republic's neighbors. Yet in 1578, they approached Bettori with a proposition of service and obedience, and it was accepted with alacrity. A named register of Cossack volunteers was established who, in return for taking the oath of allegiance, were to receive an annual fee equal to that of the hussars. They were to serve under their own ataman, who was to take his orders from the royal starosta at Cherkask. It was no secret that they were expected to direct their talents against Muscovy. Cossacks who persisted with adventures of their own invention received no mercy. In 1584, Bettori did not wait for senatorial approval before executing, in the presence of the Sultan's ambassador, 30 Zaporozhians who had crossed into the Turkish lands without permission. End quote. The combination of these reforms strengthened Poland's position. The military had a much more clearly delineated line of defense in the form of an army that could be called up on a moment's notice, and wisely accepting the Cossacks' offer of allegiance was a prudent move that simultaneously eliminated the ongoing threat of Cossack violence and brought that previous foe into the fold. These reforms were well-timed, as Poland was at war, and having a stable domestic front, a solid revenue base, the support of the nobility, and a well-oiled military were all going to be needed to defeat Grand Duke Ivan. Grand Duke Ivan, also known more commonly with the epithet Ivan the Terrible, was, to put it lightly, not a peace-loving neighbor. Pursuing an expansionist policy— what? A czar with an expansionist policy doesn't surprise you? At the expense of whatever neighboring state looked most vulnerable, Ivan was a threat to Poland and Lithuania. Bettori was well aware of this threat when he took the throne. As Davies tells us, quote, "The prime object of Bettori's concern was the Republic's eastern neighbor, the Grand Duchy of Moscow and its Grand Duke Ivan IV. Muscovy was no ordinary state, and Ivan was no normal neighbor. It was not just that Muscovy had been in conflict with Lithuania over Smolensk throughout the century, nor that Ivan had renewed the war in Livonia during the late interregnum. Such things were commonplace. Nor did it matter unduly that the Muscovites' cruelty and ambition was unmatched in a cruel and ambitious age. Bettori's concern centered on the demonic quality of Moscow, which was visibly consuming not just the lands of its neighbor, but the best citizens and traditions of Russia itself. It enabled Ivan to pursue claims to lands and honors in Russia far beyond any which he, or his forebears, or his remote principality had ever possessed. The gathering of the Russian lands by this Third Rome has as much rationale in Eastern Europe as might have been professed in Western Europe by some Irish prince who thought to gather the Celtic lands of France, Spain, and Britain under the aegis of Dublin, or by some Duke of Franconia who sought to restore the Frankish Empire of Charlemagne. Entirely devoid of any taint of the Renaissance or Reformation, Ivan's Moscow lived by its own pathological values in its own closed world." End quote. Bettori was well aware of this challenge upon his coronation, and when the threat of violence from Ivan finally materialized in 1577 with the invasion of Livonia, Bettori's efforts to put his house in order paid off. We hear the pace of this war from Zamoyski, who tells us, quote, "While Lithuanian detachments managed to contain the invasion of Livonia, Stefan Batory decided that a conclusive war was called for. He made his preparations and, in 1579, declared war on Muscovy. Having concentrated his forces near Vilno under hetmans Mikołaj Mielecki of Poland and Mikołaj Radziwiłł of Lithuania, he moved on Polotsk, which he quickly captured. In the following year, Stephen collected an army of 30,000, which moved out in 3 corps, one commanded by himself, the other 2 by Mikołaj Radziwiłł and Jan Zamoyski. The Poles took Wielkie Luki and other fortresses. In the following year, 1581, the Polish army besieged Pskov, which was ably defended by the brothers Ivan and Vasily Shoyski. As the terrible winter set in, King Stephen returned to Poland, leaving Zamoyski in command outside Pskov." End quote. With the war going very well for the Poles, you're probably expecting a gambit from Ivan to turn the tide in his favor. And what a gambit it was. As Davies tells us, quote, "In the middle of the war, the religious factor was suddenly underlined when Ivan sent an envoy to the Pope. He complained that the unity of Christendom was being disturbed by the activities of a Turkish employee. The Vatican responded. Mindful of the long-held project of union between the Catholic and Orthodox faiths, agreed in 1439 but never implemented, it dispatched a Jesuit diplomat, Antoni Posavini, to see what could be arranged. In 1581, Posavini met Bettori at Vilno and later proceeded to Moscow. Ivan showed interest in his shaven face and in the Pope's good fortune in being carried around in a litter. He refused to discuss religion. The unity of Christ was not enhanced." End quote. Following this, the war continued to turn against Ivan. The siege of Pskov lasted for months and involved hundreds of thousands of soldiers. There was no sign Ivan would be able to repel this force. Eventually, an agreement was reached whereby everyone retreated to their respective corners. Poland had some slight territorial gains, while Ivan avoided losing the city of Pskov. In addition, both sides agreed to a 10-year truce. After the war concluded, Bettori didn't have much time to enjoy the peace. In trying to capitalize on his victory by consolidating gains and instigating new wars, he met resistance from the nobility. As Davies tells us, quote, "The king fell into a deep depression. On May 15, 1585, at Niepomovich, where he was shunning the company of his wife and court, he composed his will, berating the Poles for their ingratitude and confining his largesse to the interests of his native Transylvania. He languished in this mood for more than a year and died suddenly at Grodno on December 12, 1586, unshriven. There were fears of poison." End quote. And so, Batory's reign ended with a mixed record. While he did succeed in temporarily reforming some parts of the state apparatus and successfully repelled Ivan, his successes were impermanent. Within a short period of time after his death, Poland had fallen back into disunity. I'm sure for the people who lived through Batory's reign that they enjoyed the stability he brought while he was alive. But retrospectively, it's clear that he didn't go far enough in preparing his lands for the future. But he may not even have had that opportunity to go far enough. And that's where we're going to leave it for today. We'll pick up next time with the reign of King Sigismund III. As always, a big thank you to my supporters on Patreon. You make this show possible through your philanthropic efforts. If you'd like to join this noble crew, you can do so at patreon.com/historyofpolandpodcast. You can also support the show by sharing it with your history-minded friends or by following along on Twitter and Facebook under History of Poland Podcast. Until next time, thanks for listening.